What's going on, y'all? KMB here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb this week in Marvel Snap. For several weeks in a row, this list has started with Move Bounce. This week is not a change from that pattern, but I will note that there are many options for the role that Move Bounce provides to this metagame. Typically, the reason Move Bounce starts off these lists is because it's the list that goes the tallest. It puts the "you must be this tall to ride" on people, and it's very hard to interact with. There are several other lists that go extremely tall in multiple lanes and are a little bit more consistent or have different ways of interacting with your opponent than Move Bounce has access to. That's not to say that this list is any worse than it has been. In fact, I think as it's gained wider adoption, people have gotten better at the list, meaning that unlike other lists that typically get worse the wider they're adopted, I think this list has actually gotten a little bit better. There are plenty of different individual swap-ins you can do when you're playing Move Bounce. This is just a list that I prefer. You do not need to be running Frigga. You do not need to be running USAgent. You can be a much more stripped down, streamlined version of this deck. But the basic gist of what this deck is trying to do is get a lot of scalers that fundamentally scale a little bit more than they should. I think in order to explain why Move Bounce is so good and has been so good, it's necessary to zoom out a little bit and ask yourself one question. How many points do you think one move should be worth? And when you think about that number, I don't think it's easy to look at any of the scalers in this deck, Vulture, Dagger, and Human Torch, and say, oh yeah, that's the amount of points one move should be worth. Now, a lot of this is down to the existence of Madam Web. Madam Web gave this deck a lot of ability to move multiple things in a way that normally this deck was pretty parasitic. It's a deck that really needed to use one card to get one move. Madam Web gave it 3 moves. She's very obviously extremely strong. But even outside of that, what this deck is built around is getting more moves per card. When you have your bouncers to get your Ghost Spiders happening twice, your Iron Fists happening twice, you have your Madam Web that's already on the board, it's happening, and suddenly this deck is moving 7 or 8 cards per turn. It's getting 6 or more power every time it does that, not per turn, per game. And that's just a number that is very hard to overcome. And more importantly, a lot of that comes from hand at the end of the game, meaning that you are in a situation where it's very hard to interact with. That is the baseline power of this deck. The numbers are very high, the interaction is very low. Let's talk about some of those other decks competing for the same role that Move Bounce has, which is basically big numbers, hard to interact with. That's the gist of what Move Bounce is doing, and that's also the gist of what this deck is doing. A lot of people might look at this and say, what the hell are you talking about, KM? Why are we seriously playing Havok? And the answer is because he's very, very large. When you look at Bruce Banner, that is effectively a card that costs you 4 energy or so. You play it on turn 2, it costs you some energy over the course of the game, and you might get a 12 out of it. You play Havok on turn 4, you will get a 12 out of it. If you've basted that Havok, you'll get a 15 out of it. Havok is like if Bruce Banner had actual stats on it. And I realize that's a ringing non-endorsement of Bruce Banner. We'll probably cover that a little bit later. But what this deck, again, is really trying to do is just scale upwards. And I think it's weird to look at a deck like this and say that it's very dependent on drawing Kitty Pryde, but it honestly is, because a lot of the time what you're looking to do is set up a Thena, get a Bast on some stuff, and then Kitty +3 the entire rest of the game once you've gotten a Havok out on about turn 4. So you'll have this massive point factory, but you do need to continue to be pumping the Thena, which is where Kitty Pryde can be so useful here. What this deck has over either traditional bounce or Move Bounce is those 2/3 drops on the back end. Red Guardian is very good at dealing with stuff that you might not be prepared to deal with your only points plan. If you run into things like Living Tribunal, if you run into an opposing Madam Web, that is the card that can really deal with that stuff. In addition, you also have Cosmo, again, very good into a lot of different things, including Move Bounce. So this is effectively a deck that has lower but similar point output to Move Bounce, giving it a fairly similar matchup profile in a lot of those situations, but also has very specific tech that is quite good against Move Bounce. Red Guardian, of course, blowing up a Madam Web, or a Dagger left alone, or something along those lines. And Cosmo preventing those final turn moves can be a really valuable tool as well. That is the main gist of what this deck is trying to do. And it's been one of the highest performing decks over the last 7 days at high infinite of any deck at all. When you see this, I don't want you to sleep on it. I don't want you to be like, oh, my opponent played Havok, this is a free win. This deck has a lot of points, a lot of good interaction, and some genuine upside over typical bounce and move bounce lists. Finally, in this metagame, normal bounce is building for maximum point output. I've seen some cut sages for werewolf by nights. You can do that if you'd like. But I think that the general gist that you need to get for normal bounce is we want large numbers of points, and we want them as fast as possible and as consistently as possible. This is sort of move bounce's smaller but stockier cousin. It's not going to get to the heights that move bounce can get to. Move bounce can dunk, maybe this deck can't, but it will consistently get up there. And in a metagame where consistency can have some value and being able to go over the top of things can have some value, that is an endorsement of this deck generally. The issue is with Doom 2099 decks, with anti-Venom decks, with all of these decks, these mid-range decks that have the ability to really like cheat points onto the board at high rates, you need to be very sure that you're going to be able to go over the top of them. And that is less certain than it was previously. Because those decks have more free points in them, because they're playing Doom 2099 and things of that nature, they might actually be able to outpoint a lane of 1/6 demons, right? Like, that is a real risk that you run, that they can just have more points in all 3 lanes than that 1/6 demon full lane. That's the kind of thing that's very awkward for you. And that is part of why we have this Sage plus Hitmonkey thing going on, right? I do think that if you really wanted to focus on beating those Doom 2099 decks, it might be good to go towards Werewolf by Night, because a lot of those Doom 2099 decks don't have the ability to interact. Unfortunately, there are a lot of decks that still do have the ability to interact with Shang-Chi and Shadow King, and having priority on the final turn as Werewolf can do can be very awkward for you. However, if you're good at managing a werewolf, I can see that swap happening, because you just need some beef. You need a guy that's going to be like 10 power in these lanes. And then you surround that with your smaller guys. You have a guy that's 10 or 12, and then your Hitmonkey is 10 or 12, and then you're looking at actually being able to go over the top of these decks that sort of split power across the board in meaningful ways. And I think that's what this deck is doing and what this deck should be doing. And the issue is only that, like, you have to sort of make sacrifices here that you don't have to make in Move Bounce. Move Bounce gets to have the cake and eat it too. It gets its massive scalers, and they sit in hand, so nobody can interact with them. So you get the wins against the Doom 2099 mid-range, and you also get the wins against everyone who's trying to play things that interact with you. This deck has to choose, because its scalers don't scale as high as the scalers in Move Bounce, which means that it can end up in awkward and bad situations a little bit more. If you're looking for a good mid-range deck, I think it's very hard to do better than Ajax AV. I think this is pretty much my favorite mid-rangey deck of the bunch right now. By far my most successful deck this season. I trend towards enjoying mid-rangey decks, and this has been the best of those by a large margin for me. It's an excellently positioned deck right now, very good into Doom 2099 stuff, but retains the ability to go very tall so that you are not instantly dead to a bunch of different things that Move Bounce can do to you. This is a deck that is not favored into Move Bounce, but has play, thanks to cards like Red Guardian and Shadow King, thanks to the ability to go very tall. You aren't going to be completely dead to these decks that are building to make you completely dead. And I think that that is the biggest thing for me that makes this deck tick. I enjoy a deck that, even if it doesn't have all favored matchups, that's a bit of an unrealistic ask, has play in its losing matchups. And I think of all the mid-range decks, this has way more play into the decks that are built to go over the top of it than anything else. And that also includes Arishem. I feel like this deck is an excellent deck into Arishem. I've often felt that Ajax decks are like that, because Ajax is able to go so tall and be so threatening, and because Arishem is typically also fairly vulnerable to USAgent plays, this deck is very able to play around final turn Alioths a lot of the time, and that means that you are able to do a lot of damage to a deck like Arishem, which is pretty reliant on that final turn Alioth. Arishem is also, in addition, I've never seen Arishem with less relevant tech for this matchup than it is right now. It's just not a deck that can really afford to play Luke Cage, even if it kind of wants to. It's playing Killmonger, and it's playing Lady Deathstrike, and I think that is correct. but that does make it weaker in this instance a lot of the time. And that means that you are able to catch them in a sort of situation where their pants are down effectively. I also think that this deck is favored into a lot of the Doom 2099 decks. In order for it to not be favored into any Doom 2099 deck, that Doom 2099 deck, A, has to be running Luke Cage, and B, has to draw and play Luke Cage. And I think every scenario other than that, this deck kind of crushes it. There are a couple of interesting Scorn decks. This is still my preferred one because, as though it may seem that I am a super tilt monster, I actually do have a decent tolerance for RNG when it is necessary, and I think that this is one of those decks that requires that tolerance. You can try doing the Malekith Strong Guy build as well if you want to have just less of the BS in here, less of the Fenris Wolf, less of the Goon Knight, less of the Gambit, all that stuff. I get it. You can try it if you want that other stuff out of here. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just think that this deck is a little bit more consistent at doing what the deck wants to do and has a little bit more top-end potential because of the power of those cards that we have in here. I hardly think it is required, and if you happen to have Malekith instead of Fenris Wolf, it can be a very easy swap in for the Strong Guy package instead of this package. That said, what this deck does very well is roll downhill. Once it starts doing its thing, it's very hard to stop. The most prominent weakness it has is Dracula getting Red Guardianed, but it's actually not the hardest thing to play around. For example, there are going to be some games where you realize your opponent is going to Red Guardian your Dracula, you can just play the Apocalypse into that lane. It's okay. Like, if you're like, oh, I lose to a Red Guardian here, but nothing else, just put the Apocalypse there. It's going to be fine. And so there are things you can do to sort of mitigate the issues that causes, but a lot of the time what this deck does is just create large numbers, do a lot of dangerous stuff, Swarms, Scorns, Morbius, Dracula. These are cards that can really scale high. They're just big stat sticks that just effectively you get for free once you are able to have them happen. Downside is that if the deck does not start rolling downhill, if it doesn't, like, you know, get a Swarm to 0 pretty early and then be able to Colleen wing it, things like that, then it can really run into issues because of how clunky a lot of the discard cards are with each other. You're basically always running a risk of discarding your MODOK, for example, when you play something like a Gambit, and it just will happen some of the time, even if that is the right play to make, and that can feel pretty punishing. I am still here for Arishem lists. I know a lot of people have been messing around with other stuff. I'm still here. I still think that we are correctly identifying we want those 2/2 drops. That's the biggest thing I'm pretty sure about. Cable Valentina, Arishem staples. We love that. And I think we want to build around aggressive 4 drops. Again, the flex slots here are really Killmonger and Lady Deathstrike, but I haven't found a good reason to cut Lady Deathstrike. You could talk me into cutting Killmonger. I think Killmonger for Shang-Chi would be a reasonable thing to do here, but cutting Lady Deathstrike just does not seem appealing to me right now. She's just extremely strong in a lot of different situations, blowing up opposing Luke Cages, blowing up opposing Madam Webs, blowing up opposing Doom 2099s, blowing up a lot of things that are really relevant, and because of the extra energy you get to blow that stuff up much earlier, which means that once you've dealt with a problematic card, you can, especially if it's like a card that scales, for example, like, that can be really good for you. Let's say it's turn 3, your opponent played a Thena and a Kitty Pryde. Well, going into turn 4, you can just blow up that Thena. Stuff like that is really, really, really strong. And so having the accelerated version of this card is a big plus for Arishem, in my opinion. I think Lady Deathstrike belongs in this deck. I think you could talk me out of Killmonger. Killmonger was originally in here because there were a lot of 1-drops that it was reasonable to hit. People weren't playing around it very much, but now people tend to be playing around it a little bit more. And people kind of know we don't have Shang-Chi now. And I think that's a problem as well. I'm not saying it's like 100% you gotta make that swap. I still run the Killmonger. This is still the list that I play, but I'm leaning more towards that swap than I was last week. If you want to all in with Doom 2099, I think that this shell is the right one to do it in. I've been pretty clear that I don't think all-inning Doom 2099 is the best way to play it, and especially as the closer we are to the release of the card and everyone playing stuff that counters it, the worse this kind of thing gets. But one of the things that I've noticed, at least in this week, is that since Bruce Banner effectively just, like, didn't come out, like, it didn't really do anything, People are finding their experimentation kicks just trying stuff, and this deck is definitely good enough to beat a lot of experimental stuff. The notable downsides this deck has are mostly related to things like move bounce existing, things like all the decks that go over the top of it existing and being popular, and things like Ajax Venom, but you do run a Luke Cage, it is kind of okay. And I think when you reduce the bad matchups this deck has to just being the move bounce stuff on a good draw, it's a lot more acceptable. Like, because we have Luke Cage in here, we don't instantly lose to AV Ajax, which means it's fine enough, I guess, right? If we didn't have Luke Cage in here, I would say this deck would be damn near unplayable. But at least having one of those matchups be able to be flipped on that final turn, even if he ends up floating 3 energy, is relevant enough that I do enjoy having it. I also would recommend that when you're in those matchups, if you can afford to, hold the Luke Cage or play it protected. And by protected, I mean Zabu, right? One suggestion that I've seen from my comments is that if you don't have Hydro Bob, you can try to play Agony instead, and that will allow you to do Agony into Penny openers, and I think that's actually a really slick and interesting thing to do, and I wouldn't be necessarily opposed to it. Remember though, when you're up against a deck where Luke Cage is good, you are also going to be up against a deck where you are vulnerable to Red Guardian. So do everything you can to play around it. It's why Zabu has such value here, allowing your Luke Cage to survive Red Guardian, allowing your Doom 2099 to survive Red Guardian. That stuff's really important. This is another list people have been playing. I personally think it's the worst of the Doom 2099 lists you can play, but it's worth covering because people are playing it. This is the kind of thing people are experimenting with. Obviously, you have your super nut draw of Zabu on turn 1 into drawing Storm into the whole old combo that we used to do with Legion. You can do strong stuff in this deck. It's not like you're really giving up a ton on power, but ultimately, I think it's better to just go for the points here, because when you have a deck like this, if you're not doing the combo, your cards are worse than the cards in the deck that we just talked about, and the deck that we just talked about has some really defined bad matchups that this deck is not going to be able to beat with those cards that it added into it. So what we end up creating is basically the deck from that we just talked about, but like a little bit worse into the matchups that matter, in exchange for having a very rare I win button. That's not to say it's not a good thing, and there are additional things that this deck gets to do. It's just not a very good time to really be a Storm deck, and I think if it were a good time to be a Storm deck, this would be much more justifiable. But it's like, okay, I'm going to be a Storm deck in a world where people are playing Doom 2099, normal Doctor Doom, and Magneto in a bunch of stuff. Alternatively, I'm going to be a Storm deck in a world where people are playing a lot of cards that move. It's not the right time for this to be a thing, but it is the kind of construction that you're going to want to keep in mind for later. In this metagame, this is just a worse version of the previous deck, but there are metagames where that would not be true. Last of our Doom 2099 decks, but most certainly not least, is of course Scream 2099. I do think this is a very clever way to play this deck. I do think this is probably the best way to play Scream. I realize there are other ways to build this deck. I personally still prefer this one. It is what I like to call the low investment Doom 2099 strategy, where previous decks that we've talked about with Doom 2099 were high investment, very much about Doom 2099, Psylocking into Doom 2099. Here, Doom 2099 is a supporting strategy or a backup strategy that can be pivoted away from if you are going to be vulnerable to a giant USAgent, for example. That is not a guarantee that you are always going to win with the other strategy this deck has. Scream is very good, but you kind of need to draw her on 2. But I will say that drawing Scream on 2 is one of the strongest plays in the entirety of Marvel Snap. I don't think people give Scream enough respect as an extremely powerful card. This is a card that basically says scale by 4, and that is unprecedented on a 2-drop. She's extremely powerful. Drawing her on 2 is unbelievable. It is one of the strongest things you can do. Her only weakness is typically that she can get outscaled by things that like move bounce, but even then, Scream is good into move bounce. Like, there are things you can do about this, right? And I think that Scream generally is one of the best shells in Marvel Snap, and optimizing it is going to be important. The problem is, when you don't draw Scream, boy, is this deck a little awkward. We've had different Surfer lists on the last few iterations of this tier list, and I wanted to put this one up there that's been performing recently fairly well because it is so different from what we have previously shown on here. I just wanted to put it on here because I think it's very cool. Obviously, this is more of a stand-in. Any Surfer list can be pretty good right now. They're all kind of doing the same thing. This is a very strong deck with the addition of Galacta, who has very clearly become a staple in the list. I just wanted to show this take on it, which at the time of recording has over a 200 game sample size in top 10% Infinite, about a 58% win rate on Untapped, which is worth noting. This is not a list I am personally particularly experienced with, but I do think it goes to show that there is some power in the Surfer core that deserves further exploration than it's been getting. This is a deck that is much easier to play than the previous iterations of Surfer. It is much more straightforward. You understand what this deck is doing. And I think that kind of stuff is very relevant. Like, this deck does what it wants to do consistently because you have more than one 2-drop, right? Like, you're actually playing cards earlier in the game. And the question becomes, is that going to be worth doing? Would you rather be doing this, or would you rather play 1 2-drop Killmonger Nova? There's open questions here. But I do think that this is the kind of thing that is worth investigating, is worth taking a look at, and so far the preliminary results have been pretty good. Surfer is able to output a lot of points. There's definitely some modifiers that I might like to make here, but it is worth talking about how this is genuinely a fairly functional deck in terms of point output, and that's rare for a deck that plays Nakia. To me, Wiccan is a little bit in the doghouse right now. I think both of the other 4-drops you can build around, Doom 2099 and Anti-Venom, are a little bit out competing it. I think that there are multiple ways you can play Wiccan right now. Like, this is one, but I've also seen a lot of the Scarlet Spider merge Wiccan that is pretty interesting as well. It's just ultimately, when you look at the numbers, the output that you're actually getting, the value prop for Wiccan becomes a little bit less, desirable, especially in a world where people are playing a lot of Doom 2099. One of the advantages that AV gets is being able to be a deck that is built kind of like this, that also gets to play a card like USAgent in order to beat the other decks that are like this, and gets to play a card like Luke Cage in order to beat the decks that are playing USAgent to beat decks like this. And that's part of why I think this version of the deck, or this version of midrange, ends up performing a little bit worse comparatively to that other stuff. I do think there's some really cool stuff you can do here. I also think that it is very crucial at this point to be running that Lady Deathstrike in order to deal with opposing Luke Cages, USAgents, Doom 2099s, all that stuff you gotta have answers to. Lady Deathstrike is quite strong and does answer a lot of that stuff, but ultimately I sort of wonder, if you're playing this deck, would you not rather be playing Arishem at some point, because you're doing kind of the same thing. You have kind of the same weaknesses, but you're not getting the free energy out of it. You need to actually jump through some hoops to get your free energy. Now, you're very good at jumping through those hoops, don't get me wrong. The Wiccan plan has gotten much more consistent over time as we've gotten more cards that actually go in here, but it's just like, when you look at what this deck is trying to do, how often are you going to be having to curve out that USAgent? How often are you going to have to do that? It's going to be non-zero, and that's going to suck for you. You don't have a Luke Cage to make it better. It's just weird. It's a weird spot for a deck like this to be in, and I think that makes the comparison to, like, even the all-in Doom 2099 deck a little bit unflattering for Wiccan right now. I've been seeing a lot of weird PF decks recently, and I don't mean like normal PF. I'm not saying I've been seeing a lot of normal PF recently. I'm saying I've seen a lot of weird PF recently, and I'm fairly certain this is what I'm seeing, where it's just like some sort of combination of like the move package and Phoenix Force, where it's like, I will figure it out. This deck feels like a deck that's just gonna figure it out at some point. The person I've seen playing this the most is Honifer, who last time I checked was in the top 20 with it. And I am not sure exactly where this deck fits, but I can tell you that PF itself feels very strong against a lot of these mid-range Doom decks, right? Like, unless they're perfectly nutting off, this is going to be the kind of deck that beats up on a lot of straightforward mid-range. That's always been PF's role, is beating up on straightforward mid-range. It's not guaranteed, but there's some really, really strong draws in a deck like this. If you are able to get an Aranya into the multiple man, into blowing up the multiple man, into play PF with an activate Aranya, suddenly you're moving around by turn 5 2 of those guys, and they have like 10 power, and it's just like, oh, okay, that's really, really strong, and it's very hard for any other deck to actually beat that. You're getting to like 35 power on every lane, which is big enough to beat out Dr. Doom. Stuff like that's really relevant. Like, this is just a bunch of big numbers in a combo scenario, and a lot of the time when there are sort of mid-range dominated metas, you can say, look, I'm just going to go over the top of you fairly profitably, and this is a deck that can go over the top of a lot of stuff if you're getting, you know, 2 10-power Phoenix Forces by the end of turn 4 to be able to move around as you see fit in the next few turns. You're probably filling up every lane with Phoenix Forces that are 10 power, and that's just a difficult thing to beat. As the metagame switched away from being very Doom 2099 centric towards Doom 2099 just being another one of the good mid-range decks, Clog also fell in value a little bit. A lot of this deck's high win rate was due to hard countering Doom 2099 stuff, and now that that is no longer being the major part of the metagame, with so many people playing various bounce variants and things of that nature, a lot of people playing scalers now, again, this has fallen off in terms of usage and in terms of power in a meaningful and unfortunate way. I'm not saying Clog is bad now. I think you can still get the same wins out of it that you were previously getting, but it does have a fairly flat cube gain ratio, meaning that you are in trouble a lot of the time if you want something really big to happen because of this. It's probably not going to happen, and that is a bad situation to be in because you're very unlikely to gain big wins, but you're also very likely, if you start aggressively snapping with this deck, to have those snaps turned on you because everyone knows what this deck does at this point. It's very clear. An innovation I've seen recently in mill decks, courtesy of Fudge, is the inclusion of Luna Snow. One of the interesting things about what quote-unquote you would call a mill deck is that what they actually are mid-range decks that have good cards in them that can turbo out of death pretty easily because of the way that something like Yondu triggers, because of the way Misery triggers. This deck is actually able to get very cheap deaths and play a very strong mid-range game in addition to the mill part of it. And a lot of that is down to extra Luna Snow energy and the fact that your cards, those count as dying. Like, those will count as dying, and that's a really cool thing to do. Having that additional angle here, getting some extra energy to get your power out early, getting some extra energy so you can go Hood plus Misery on turn 4, having the ability to do that and then also get extra procs to make your death cheaper is really, really slick. And I think this is a genuine upgrade in the deck. I would not be surprised at all for this to become the new standard in a mill deck. I think it is a strict upgrade, and it's a very clever application of a newer card onto an older strategy. All right, y'all, thanks so much for checking out this video. If you liked what you saw, remember to like and subscribe. I, of course, have been KMB. I will see you in the next one. You have been phenomenal. Thank you so much. Remember, like and subscribe.